Hello, everybody. My name's Alan Greyeyes, and this is the third panel that we have scheduled today for the sākihiwē Music Mentors Conference. We're broadcasting today from Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their financial support of our project, along with our project partner, Studio 393. Today we've got a great panel, and I'm not the moderator. I'm going to pass it off to our wonderful moderator, Rhianna, and just duck out now. I'm going to watch, but thanks for everything, Rhianna. Off to you.
Oh, thank you, Alan. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the many traditional owners on whose lands we are meeting virtually today. For me, it's the land of the Jagera, Yugara and Yugarapu peoples of the Ipswich region of southeast Queensland. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on not only these lands, but on the lands where you may be watching also. Now, for me, music has always been the core of my being, and it continues to play a major role in my life even now. And it is central, actually, to one of the clans that I come from the Torres Strait. And the Zagareb of Mer in the Eastern Islands group of the Torres Strait were the keepers of traditional song. And when I found this out as a kid, it was a light bulb moment for me and kind of explaining why I was so obsessed with particularly contemporary music. And it's been in my being, even though the responsibility of being a keeper of those traditional songs is a role for the men of my clan only. And maybe this is how you feel about music, and maybe you have similar connections to how it speaks to you or why it speaks to you in the way that it does. But as a creator, I mean, how do you share that with people like me? So I'm really excited about the knowledge contained on this panel, and I'm hoping that it'll give you ideas around how you can get your music heard here in Australia, but also in understanding a way that Indigenous Australian artists are being heard around the world also. And with me, I have Alethea Beetson, Sue Ray, and Stephen Green. Now, Alethea, would you like to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name's Alethea Beetson. I'm a Cubby Cubby and Wiradjuri woman living on Turrbal Jagera and Jagera country here in so-called Brisbane, which is very, very close to where Rhianna is, just down the road. I am a theatre maker and I program music across a range of spaces. So I am the First Nations programmer for Q Music, which also produces Big Sound, and I am curating First Nations music for Brisbane Festival. And when I'm not doing that, I have the immense pleasure of being artistic director of Digi Youth Arts, which is an Indigenous youth arts organisation.
Sue, would you like to introduce who you are and what it is that you do?
Hi, I'm Sue Ray, and I currently live in Toowoomba, which is about 2 hours west of Brisbane. But my mob basically is the Gamilaroi from central New South Wales, and I am a singer-songwriter. I have been performing in various bands and solo projects for about over 20 years actually, and more recently I've sort of been aiming to do more mentoring. I think I've done a lot of work towards my craft. I've studied sound engineering, video production, acting. I did a diploma of acting for 3 years, and then I moved to Nashville where I studied really the craft of songwriting. So for me, as an inherent storyteller, much like yourself, Rhianna, I really love that in our culture, it's like music is what has told our stories for forever, and I've always just wanted to tell stories. And so learning the craft of songwriting was really integral for me to get better at doing it more effectively. So I've come back to Australia now, and I've worked with a number of groups, including Alethea with Digi Youth Arts, with APRA and Starting Ground programs. I've worked with Deadly Ways, Indigenous youth program here in Toowoomba at the university, basically teaching young fellas and young women how to write music and express themselves through their music in a way that allows them to get in touch with their history, but also their own emotions, because sometimes we can feel a bit overwhelmed and unable to share our experiences. So I think for me, songwriting is that for me. So that's my kind of specialty, I guess.
Thanks, Sue. And Stephen, would you like to introduce who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. I run SGC Media, which is a PR and various other arms company out of Brisbane. we run a number of PR businesses focusing on commercial, indie, and metal music. We also run 3 media outlets: Purple Sneakers, which is a electronic and hip hop blog; The Faction, which is a 24/7 metal radio station online; and soon to launch in about a week's time, Country Town, which is a country music website, of which Australia sorely needs one. Or that's my that's my guess anyway. I'll tell you at the end of next week if that's correct. We also run Radio Monitor, which is as the name suggests, a system that monitors radio and reports back on airplay to all the major labels and independents. And we also create the radio airplay charts for Australia. I'm sure there's some other stuff I've forgotten, but that'll do for now.
And probably something that you probably wouldn't say about yourself, Stephen, but that I would, is that you've also been quite a strong ally for Indigenous musicians in this country, and you've worked a lot with Indigenous festivals and also the National Indigenous Music Awards for a long time as well. Now, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting about this festival that we're a part of is that it's one of the lines of it is reaffirming the humanity of Indigenous peoples. And I think as Indigenous people, we always like to know who we're talking to behind the bios, getting to know the real person underneath all of those fancy words that we tend to hear when we, have those formal introductions. And so I've got one question for all of you, just so that we get to know the person you are rather than the person you are in your jobs and what you do in the industry. And Alethea, I want to know from you first about, this path that you've taken has sort of wandered into the realm that is music for you, but you have a thing about the one song. Can you tell me about the one song and how you knew that this was a thing that was a constant in your life?
I was reflecting on it recently, actually. I was like, how did I end up here? And I've always been obsessed from as long as I can remember with like one song, like that I've heard and I immediately love it. And so I remember the really long trips, because I grew up in Toowoomba, where Sue is from, but we had, connections to Roma and Surat, and we drove to country towns a lot here in so-called Queensland. And you would just spend the entire car trip waiting for that one song to come on the tape deck. And like each tape deck, you had the one song. And then that like kind of transformed into school. Like I'd try and time when we would drive to school so that I could get the song that played after the news. And like, it was only like a little trip, so I would get that song and just being bitterly disappointed if it was a song that I did not want to hear. Like it just like actually would ruin my day. And like I've ended up a theatre maker, so I'm overly dramatic about how much it ruined my day in the grand scheme of things. And then that, I've always had that, but I think it's probably definitely informed. So when Shazam existed, it was like the greatest thing of my life, because I could like hear that one song that pulled me in and was like know what it was immediately. And I think really, the one thing that I'm confident enough to say about my theatre shows that I make is that they have really good soundtracks. And I think it comes from, I know how to pick that one song that can evoke the audience. So I thank all musicians for what they do for my own practice.
So for you, did you always know that you were going to be a musician, and did you always know that it was going to be country music?
I guess I'm one of the lucky ones. I was raised in a musical family. My dad was in a number of bands. He owned a musical instrument store here in town. So I didn't grow up on weekends going to cricket matches or sports games or footy games. I went to music concerts with my dad. I went to his gigs. I started learning the organ when I was about 4 or 5, and then the piano, and then guitar, and I just always knew. And I think I had that defining moment at the graduation of grade 1, where they chose this girl called Alexandra to get up and sing a Christmas carol. And I remember sitting in the audience really dirty thinking, that should be me, because I'm going to be a big singer. And I still remember that. And it was country music that I started in. Dad was the chairman of the Toowoomba Country Music Club. So country music I'd been raised with. But by the time I became a teenager, I got into like Tori Amos and Sarah McLachlan, and then gradually Pantera and all of the heavy metal. I rebelled against country music for many years and got into punk bands and garage rock bands and rockabilly bands. And then about 28, I got sick of carrying my bass rig up the staircase at the back of this venue called the Troubadour in Brisbane. There was about a dozen staircases, and I sort of thought, I'm going to go back to playing just guitar. And started playing sort of folk gigs, and somehow gradually came back to country music. And now I'm in a couple of country music bands that does vintage country music. I write country music. I lived in Nashville for years. So I didn't, if you'd have told me 20 years ago I'd be doing country music, I'd have laughed in your face, but here I am.
And Stephen, I mean, you were quite obsessed with music when you were younger, and I want you to tell me about the teenage Greenie, because I don't think I can call you Stephen through this whole thing. I only know you as Greenie, and it feels really weird calling you your first name. So Greenie, I mean, tell me about how you got your first job in music retail.
Yeah, well, my first job in retail was a local shopping centre record store, and I just decided that's what I wanted to do. So every Thursday, my mum would go and do the shopping because we had late night shopping on Thursday nights, and I just went in there every single week and said, I want a job, I want a job, I want a job. They must have had at least 20 versions of my resume, because every week I just took it in, and then eventually, someone didn't turn up for their shift, and they threw a Triple J t-shirt at me and said, get changed, you look like a dork. And I got the job, and that was that. I mean, I think I'd always been into music before that. I was that kid in grade 1 that got given the song in the Christmas play. And sorry, it was but yeah, I sang from a very young age, right from being a kid, singing carols at my grandparents, and at Christmas time, and like there's just always been, if you keep counting back, that's kind of where I think I realized that the effect that music had on everybody, I think, is huge, and for me it was massively transformational. And whether it was doing musical theatre through school, or whether it was singing in a big band after that. Obviously, post school, my singing career got shelved, but I kind of got obsessed with, I guess, the impact that it had, whether it was singing it or playing it or listening to it. I think there's a lot of people that take music for granted and don't realize the impact that it's having on them, or that it could have on them. And I think if we can get more amazing music to people, it will help mental health. It will help so many things in life, and particularly when it comes to telling stories and telling our stories. The transformational nature of what music can have on culture. And I'm purposely not using the word politics there, but there's just so much that it can do. And I guess I've always figured that if there was one thing that I could do with my life that would make a difference, it was going to be something there. And one of my early jobs, of course, had a Canadian connection. Anyone flying on Canadian Airlines between 2000 and 2002 would have heard my dulcet tones hosting the Asian channel. So there you go.
Well, I'm glad you gave up musical theatre to be with us now, Greenie.
Or did I?
I don't think you have, to be honest. Now, Greenie, when, because this is kind of the business that you work in, what do you think needs to be considered when releasing music in Australia? I mean, is there a better time of the year than another time of the year?
I think it depends on really knowing what genre that you're working in and where you sit on the food chain. I mean, if you're Robbie Williams and you're asking me when the best time to put a greatest hits album out is, then the answer is Christmas, because there's so many more physical sales at that time of year. But if you're a country artist and it's your very first single and you're asking me whether you should drop it in January, I would say no, because everyone's in Tamworth mode. If you're an indie band and you're asking what the best time of the year is, I would say the first half of the year, because the back end of the year gets a little bit crazy with labels trying to release things for Triple J's Hottest 100, which occurs in January. So I guess it's less about having a one size fits all approach and more about really understanding who the people are that you're trying to reach and what's going to be going on in their lives at the time. I think one of the interesting questions that I've had obviously constantly this year is, do I put my release off because of COVID? And should we release now while everyone's in lockdown, or should we wait? And if this is the one single that I've been waiting for the last year to release, do I just hold off? And once again, the answer there is, who are you trying to get to? If the people that you're trying to get to are in lockdown and really need this right now, then maybe it is the right time. If you're releasing a dance floor banger and no one's allowed to get up from their seat or they get ejected from the venue, then maybe now's not the right time for that as well. So as with probably a lot of questions today, that the answer is depends.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, I will preface with, particularly when we get to the part about talking about festivals, this is what we're talking pre-COVID, and maybe that will look completely different, once we get to the other side of this pandemic. But I mean, Sue, for you, I mean, as an artist, what have you found for you in terms of your strategy around when you release music that has worked for you, particularly here?
Again, I have to confess that I haven't released an album since 2011 in Australia, because basically after that I moved over to Nashville and sort of pursued more of a songwriting aspect with my career. I wanted to be a songwriter for other artists. I thought that's what I wanted to do for a while, so I didn't really focus on releasing my own stuff. But then when I came back, I agreed I didn't want to release around January, because January is when the Tamworth Country Music Festival is. And if you don't know, obviously in Canada what that is, it's Australia's premier country music festival. So everybody's focused on Tamworth, everybody's trying to release stuff, and it gets saturated and you can disappear in the noise. I think I choose usually around the start of June, because that's when I tend to release things, or around my birthday in July, because I find it's winter and my kind of music is more kind of chill, laid back. So I kind of think, well, people in winter want to listen to that. Does that sound silly? But that's when I've chosen to release stuff. And I think people are inside more rather than being out. My music's not exactly summer music that you're going to play when you're hitting the beach. So I think it's music when people can drive to, they can be in their car, they can be inside. And again, I have the same dilemma this year. I was going to release, we'll try to release an album this year. And then when COVID struck, it was I couldn't get together with the other musicians because they lived all over the place. Obviously money became an issue because a lot of my festival gigs that were upcoming got canned. So my income became sketchy. I didn't know if I could afford it. Everyone started applying for grants because that was their only income, and it became really competitive. So I haven't released anything, but at the same time, I feel like I should, because some of the music I write is about focusing on your emotion and anxiety and depression, which are things that I have lived, so I sort of think maybe it is a good time to release music this year, independently. A lot of people are doing it from home now. Some really great albums are being made in people's bedrooms. And I think if you've got the facility to do that, maybe don't be afraid to, because as you said, the future of music is kind of all a bit uncertain. It's sort of the Wild West at the moment for us all. It feels like we're starting from scratch again. So I wish I could give words of wisdom right now in relation to releasing music, but I think follow your heart, do what feels right, know where you are in the food chain, just like Stephen said, know what genre you are, and maybe it's not impossible to contact people like Stephen and just ask, look it up, Google publicists or publishers in your area, and don't be afraid to send them an email. This is what they do for a living. Just ask that advice, ask what they think, and maybe go from there.
Alethea, you aren't necessarily a musician, but you work with the Ancient Bloods. And I wanted to ask you about the Ancient Bloods because it's a cyclical band, and you released the first Ancient Bloods album, which gained a lot of traction. And I'm wondering, you've got the second album for the new version of Ancient Bloods coming soon. And I mean, have you had to consider what you're doing in terms of releasing here and really looking at what's happening in the Australian market at the moment?
Absolutely. We have, I guess, to consider what's happening, but also in alongside the fact that it is a mentoring program. So it's been a nice reminder that, yes, there's what's happening in releases within the so-called Australian context, but the cultural significance of our work doesn't have that timeline. It's just kind of culturally significant. And so for the second one, we're really lucky that we're actually working with Greenie to look at not just the music and how we release that music, but how we talk about the cultural significance of the work and tell the story of, you know, a group of young people sharing their stories, and being the second kind of round that did it. And I suppose we sort of, I imagine that when you ask me this question in 2 years again, when we're releasing the third, I will have a whole bunch of lessons, because like the first time we did it, I learned how much we could do ourselves in amongst 2 weeks of panic of me being like, oh God, I have to learn how to release music. And I, you know, we did it, like, you know, between me and another musician who had all the knowledge, we did it, and we did it really, really well. And this time we've kind of gone, what is the one skill set that we don't have? And for us, it was PR. So we outsourced that because all the creative we kind of had. And then I imagine next time we'll be like, okay, what did we learn from that? And so it's like, with the cycles, we evolve with those cycles, which is, you know, our biggest lesson at the moment is probably what this conversation is about, is how do we transfer that knowledge to the Indigenous young musicians that we're mentoring as well.
Greenie, if you're trying to make an impact here as a group from overseas, I mean, do you need a booking agent or a promoter in Australia? And I mean, what have you seen in the past when it comes to international emerging artists breaking music here?
Yeah, I think probably the best advice is probably to do a lot of the research and really get your head around Australia as a market before you go shopping for whether it's a publicist or whether it's a booking agent or whatever. I mean, there's always going to be a view of the world that those you know, providers will have. And it's going to be a very narrow view based on what you're asking them to do. A publicist is going to look at everything through the lens of what is the media and what can we possibly get for it in that world. An agent is going to look at it for how much money can we get from what venue. Whereas as an artist, if you're trying to break the territory, I think it's really important to have a much more overall view, and I guess figure out where the market is and why this is a market that you're targeting. I mean, there's, you know, a lot of countries in the world. What is it about Australia that you're looking for? And I think the mistake that I see too many people making is going, well, it's kind of like, you know, like my country, and so I'll hire somebody that will just look after that territory for me. Without considering that person's only looking at the territory through one lens. So I think, you know, looking at what is it that your music, like what is it about the music that gets and holds your audience in your home country, and then where are the people that are going to react to those same things in Australia? Now, I think, you know, when it comes to you know, your question about the booking agent, it depends on what level you want to play in the country. If you're the kind of artist that doesn't want to make a loss when you tour to another country, you've got to be able to make certain sacrifices, like, you know, either you know, finding an agent that can get you good money, or sleeping on people's couches and doing small shows. And you've just got to work out what kind of a person or what kind of an artist that you are. I've seen examples, in fact, Canadian examples of people that have come over and literally just bought a plane ticket and sat at home, phoned venues randomly from Canada and booked themselves shows for a few $100 and just done a like 4-week tour, going from place to place to place, whether it's cafes and some of these tour schedules are the strangest things I've ever seen, because they're playing at places that I didn't even know were venues, and they're not actually venues, but they've come over and they've just done it because they've just knocked on doors and had an amazing experience, met amazing people, you know, not stayed at 5-star hotels, but that's the experience that they wanted out of Australia, and they've since come back and toured 2 or 3 more times. And, you know, for that artist and for what they're doing, you know, the one I'm thinking about in particular is, you know, it's very story based. He does very small venues, talks to the audience. It's as much about, you know, his life and the communication of all of those stories as it is about the music. And for him it works. I mean, if you're a stadium rock band, however, you're not going to want to be playing cafes. So in that situation, you need to find opportunities to get on the right stages. And if the stage for you has to have 500 people in front of it, you need somebody that can work out how to get 500 people in a room in this country, which means either someone that can get you on a good support, or somebody that can put you on a festival or something like that. And in those cases, then certainly having an agent is very important. But having said that, I mean, there's probably a lot of stuff you can do from there as well. If there is a larger Canadian act that's come into Australia and you want to try and ride on their coattails, it's all about personal connections. So, go begging for, go begging for supports that way. And the flip side, there's a bajillion Australian artists wanting to go and tour America as well. And Canada's pretty much America. So, find someone that find someone that you can go and tour with over there, and then they can come over here and tour with them. Like, I really think that the idea that you just can't do anything until you've got an agent, or until you've got, a lot of those things are just limiting, self-limiting beliefs that that really, your relationships with your friends and your fellow artists, that you can bridge, across countries. They're the same relationships as what a promoter does with their relationships. So there's nothing to stop you from building them yourself. And at the right time, of course, having an agent over here would be great. But you're better off with the right agent at the right time, rather than just ticking a box so that you can say you've got one.
Alethea, just off the back of what Greenie was saying, I mean, how important is it that you check in with Mob, particularly when you're looking around a booking agent or a promoter here? I mean, what is your advice around that?
I think, one of the things in terms of our relations with one another, whenever I visit other people, other Indigenous people from other countries, first and foremost, we obviously connect because of our non-homogenous similarities with our Indigenous knowledges and how we do cultures. But our other similarities are how we have to deal with the impact of colonialism, and that is also how we have to navigate the music industry. So all my relations that I've spoken to in other countries face the exact same issues in the music industry there that we face here. So Australia is very much on a journey of improving the way in which we engage with Indigenous music and Indigenous musicians and Indigenous music industry, and how we continue to give space to allow for sort of sovereign spaces. So you may not find First Nations booking agents, PR and things like that where in so-called Australia. So it's kind of like, I would not hear someone say from Turtle Island or from Canada, like, sort of, if a white fella came to me and said they were an ally, I'd be checking in with my Indigenous friends from that country as to whether they really are an ally and if that's someone that I should be working with. And likewise, it's a really good idea to check in with Mob from over here if you have those connections, to be like, hey, I want to work with this person, and what's your advice? And our advice isn't necessarily a yes or no, because each person has to make decisions, but it's like, this is what this might look like. This is if you're trying to achieve this, kind of go there. And if you don't know someone from, so-called Australia that you can connect with, there's other people in your industry, like your Mob knows some of us. So it's kind of like the Murray grapevine, we'd call it here, like where we ring around each other. It's just extending that across the globe and, connecting in with one another. And I've received great help when I've needed advice from other countries. And so it's part of our reciprocity to give that advice back to you.
So for you, I mean, as an independent artist, I mean, some of those things that Greenie was saying about making those opportunities, about some of the things that he's heard of artists doing when they've come here. I know that you've had exactly, you have a lot to say around making the opportunity yourself here if it doesn't exist as well.
Yeah, I agree. When you're an independent artist, it can feel really daunting because you see other artists out there that are represented with managers and booking agents and publicists, and you think, what am I doing wrong? It can seem really daunting of knowing where to start, because it seems unattainable almost. And but it isn't. It really isn't. I've completely bypassed all that stuff for 20 years because, as Alethea said, you can do this yourself. And the social media is a fantastic way to get out there. I mean, prior to Facebook, we had MySpace, and I think that was one of the greatest tools musicians could have been given, because you could find bands in your similar genre. You could search, where other countries, and you could literally just pick a band you liked and send them a message and say, hey, I'm coming to blah, blah, your country, and I'd love to get some gigs. Have you got any advice? And I used to get, I got messages from a band in Scotland because we were of a similar genre, and they wrote to me saying, hey, we're coming to Australia. Can you give us some advice? And I was able to give them venue names and email addresses of venues, and we would share that information. Well, Facebook's the same now. I get a lot of messages through my Facebook fan page, where other bands will write to me, or vice versa. When I was in Nashville, a lot of Australian artists would write to me personally and say, hey, we're coming to Nashville. Can you advise some local venues we might be able to get gigs at? Or I would myself say, yeah, come along. I'll get you up before my band when I've got a gig. And I think as independent artists, just don't be afraid to actually just ask other bands, ask other musicians. We're not going to bite your head off. We're all in this together. And I think we have to stop that idea that success is this limited pool, that we have to hoard all of our knowledge to ourselves so that we can keep the success to ourselves. That's a load of crap, especially in our culture with our mob. Like, once one of us does well, we bring everyone with us. And I think sharing information is one of the most integral things we can do as independent artists to help other artists succeed, because their success is your success. We're all in it together. And I see someone was having a question. Like, that's the thing, ask questions. If after this webinar, if you didn't have any questions answered, I am an open book. Write to me personally through Facebook, through my Instagram. Ask me any questions you have. I've done the same thing. I was going to America. I was moving there after I got my green card, and I was going to do a tour from LA up to Seattle, and I didn't know the first thing. So I basically contacted other bands I knew in LA, and they gave me advice, and I contacted a musician I'd met in Nashville, and he sent me his entire tour schedule of venues and phone numbers. Like, unbelievable. I was able to book a tour myself in cafes, like just cafes and little venues that suited where I was in my music. I'm not exactly a stadium musician, but I was able to play cafes and bars where we did really well, paid us money to get our, accommodation for the next show. And we had absolute great time playing from LA up to Seattle, all the way down through El Paso, back to Austin, and then over to Nashville, all independently with no booking agent or publicist or anything. The help of social media and just sheer determination. It's not as daunting as you think. It's not unattainable. You can do it yourself. And through doing it, there's this guy I know, Woody Pines from Nashville. He did it all independently. He created his own tour schedule and just relentlessly went out on the road playing those same places till eventually he got enough of a crowd in those towns that they were like, oh man, you need to play a bigger venue. And then he'd have to start playing bigger venues. And he has a really great following and can tour most of the year doing that. It takes a lot of work, but it's worthwhile and it's fun. I mean, beats any other job.
And Sue,
So-
I think you've picked up on something that I was going to ask Greenie about anyway, about, making those opportunities and the ways that you can do that business when you're in a country that is not your own and you're trying to break into that music wise. And Greenie, I wanted to ask you, like, prior to COVID, what are the main festivals in Australia and how important can they be to you breaking in? And, I know you've got a story about a band who you've seen do exactly that in terms of getting their music from Canada to Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I think Australia is a very live-based industry. I think certainly, the genres that we've got are very, very live. There's such a big history of, whether it's pub rock in the 80s or things like that. Like, there's always been that experiential thing that is often needed to break artists, so that people seeing them live, there's just nothing like it. And I think that festival culture has built up here as well. There's a lot of people that will come out for festivals that don't necessarily go to other shows throughout the year, that whether it's Splendor in the Grass or something for indie music, or whether it's Woodford for folk or Tamworth for country. There's that these are huge festivals that people just wait all year and go to. And for a lot of people who are probably a little bit more mainstream and don't spend their time trying to look for new things all the time, they become the kind of 1 week of the year where people move into things with open minds and really want to to see things that they haven't seen before they go back to their normal life. And I think certainly if breaking Australia is a key thing for you as an artist, having a more holistic look rather than just looking at where you might get played on the radio, having a look at where these live opportunities are, particularly with festivals, where you can get to people who are looking for new things. The example that Rhianna just mentioned, we worked with Half Moon Run on their first couple of albums here in Australia, and certainly on the first album, we were really struggling to get traction with it until they came out and played the Woodford Folk Festival, and there's something about that band that as soon as they got in front of an audience, they just converted people straight away. And by the end of that festival, Woodford, you do multiple shows over the 4 or 5 days, and they had after the first show, their other shows got upgraded to larger venues on the fly, and they had an additional show added, and you could just see the crowds grow from 100 at the first show to 500 at the second show and you just couldn't get near them, because that word of mouth that happens at a festival where people are sharing that experience of discovering a band was just so important. They did a show in Brisbane about a week after that festival, which had sold about 30 or 40 tickets leading into Woodford and sold out leading out of Woodford, and then we got it added to the radio to Triple J, essentially that week after that, because the hype from those people at the festival just burst out of the festival and just created such a buzz. And not every band's going to do that, obviously, but certainly if you've got that magic spark that is going to work in that context, there's nothing like physically getting in front of people. And I know it seems really weird talking about this during COVID, where none of us can actually do any of this, but
or go to a festival,
assuming we can get back to normal at some point. I think certainly for Australia, maybe don't jump on a plane and come over as your very first step, but if you've got feedback from Australia saying that the music is being well received here, then certainly looking at some of those festival opportunities, depending on your genre, obviously. But even then, there's generally, Metal World's similar. If you can get on Good Things Festival or something like that, then once again they'll take a punt sometimes on smaller bands that generally, if they came out on their own, wouldn't be filling 1,000 people venues. But it's a way to just get there and get that foothold in the market to launch the rest of your campaigns off.
So, Stephen, what do you say with those main festivals in Australia? I mean, what are the big ones that stand out for you that you think are the main ones that could be part of your strategy in kind of getting, a foothold here?
Once again, depending on genre, certainly for folk, Woodford, Tamworth for country, Good Things for metal. Metal sort of, they come and go. So there's generally one that's the one at the moment. I think that's probably it, or was 6 months ago. But yeah, there's, what else? For indie stuff, Splendor in the Grass, Falls Festival. There's also some like Dark Mofo and things like that for more experimental music. It's more about, or less about, sort of finding just the festivals that have the most people at them and working out for the genre that you're doing, where is the place that the engaged people are going. And for a small band, Splendor in the Grass might be a little bit of a stretch to be trying for, but there's a lot of smaller boutique festivals, things that may well, even though they only have 5,000 or 6,000 people at them, or even 2,000 or 3,000 people, those might be where your audience is. And once again, it's about knowing the kind of thing that, look at where your current audience is outside of Australia. What are the things that they love about your music, and what is the festival that's going to enhance that element of your performance or that element of what you do the most. If it's something that, you know, if what really is important to you is you know, the stories and talking about what, you know, what it is that you're trying to get across to an audience, then a big stage at Splendor in the Grass might be nowhere near as important as doing one of the smaller tents at Bluesfest, or doing a, you know, a small tent at Woodford. So once again, it's just about sort of, once again, like you said before, ask friends over here, you know, ask people what they think, who know the landscape, but ask people based on what you do rather than just generic.
I should say, if you have a question for any of our panelists, don't be afraid to, if you're on Zoom, drop it in the chat or drop it somewhere that the other moderators can get those to us, because they are willing to answer any of the questions that you have as well. So just on the back of that, I mean, you're obviously in the Americana music, country music realm. For you, what are those top festivals that are similar for those who might be in that genre overseas and looking for a place here?
Yeah, well, I mean, in Nashville particularly, everybody in country music wants to go there. It's like a pilgrimage almost. But there is a conference there called the Americana Music Conference, which is probably only in about its 7th or 8th year, I think, maybe more. But it's been really growing in popularity because it doesn't just offer independent bands an opportunity to play. There's actually, like, it's kind of like a music conference as well, where you can go to panels and listen to, like, things just as this. You can listen to successful artists talk about how to tour. You can listen to panels from booking agents, publicists. I mean, if you're in any job, no matter what job it is, you want to get good at that job. If you choose a career path, you want to be a surgeon, you have to go out and you have to learn your craft. This perception that just as a musician, I'm just naturally good at it and therefore stuff will come to me. It's not like that. You have to constantly work on your craft. So every opportunity you can get, if there's a music conference coming to your country or your town or your, you know, I recommend going, or to things like this, webinars, searching online for advice on how to get your music heard. And that's all, it seems silly and tedious, but you do pick up tips and tricks along the way that allow you to get better at what you do and better at marketing yourself. There's obviously Austin City Limits. I don't know if that one's still going, but there's what's the one that happens in Austin every year, the big one?
South by Southwest.
Southwest. I mean, there's big music conferences where it seems like a big deal to get a showcase there. But as an independent artist, sometimes, again, that can feel daunting. You think, oh, how did those other bands get a gig there? And I went on their website and I submitted an application and I didn't get accepted. And it can be really disheartening in a way. That's where I say go back to your grassroots. If you want to come to a country like Australia, maybe get on a map, look up musicians in your same genre, type in Americana artist or, you know, hip hop artists Australia. And, you know, you might see really famous ones, but you might find ones that only have 1,000 or 2,000 followers. They're probably going to be more approachable. Send them a letter on Facebook, send them an email or whatever. Don't be afraid to contact people and ask questions. Some will respond, some won't, but you'll be surprised who will. And I mean, and then if they say, yeah, I did a tour, go to their website and look at their tour schedule and steal the venues. If they had, you know, a little tour where they did 20 venues, Google each venue and see what size or capacity that venue is. If it looks a bit big for you, go to the next venue, and you may find smaller independent artists, say at your level, are doing little tours. Steal their venues, go to their website and then Google those venues and then email or call those venues. And if they say, oh, we go through a booking agency, contact that booking agent. Go back to the grassroots. You don't have to think it's all daunting and that it's not available to you, that those opportunities seem to happen to other people. That happens in our minds because we're artists and we're sensitive. But if you step out of being the artist and realize that what you're doing is a job, as well, if you want to make money from this and you want a career from your music, then you have to also step out of your artist self and become your manager self, unless you have one. Lucky to have one. And what would your manager do? Your manager would contact venues one day a week. Just sit down and say, every Monday at 2 p.m. I'm going to send out 10 emails. And it just becomes a habit. Like once a week, you check in, you contact other artists, you research venues. It's tedious, yeah, but it's worth it. And then you can build up your own independent following. Like you said, if you're a great performer, but you don't translate well on a recording, like I think I sound better live than I do on an album. So I try to book gigs rather than release albums, because when I go out on a gig, they hear me and go, oh, you're great. Then they buy my album at the gig. So go out and play, and don't be afraid to play small venues. Don't think you're above playing to 30 people, because some of the best shows I've ever played have been to 30 people. They've been the most poignant and the most touching. I've played to thousands of people. To me, I'd prefer a smaller
I've been
venue.
at both of those, Sue, for you. I think I've seen you do both of those, the very small one from 20 people to a lot of people actually following you. So Stephen mentioned before, Sue, about Tamworth Country Music Festival, which happens in Australia in January, which is our big country music festival. What are those other ones that you particularly look out for that operate here, that fit the genre that you do?
Yeah, I actually have a spreadsheet here I was just looking at. There's at least 17 purely Indigenous festivals in Australia. I mean, obviously at the moment, I can't guarantee that they're going to be running. So if anyone wants to write to me personally, I'm happy to send you the names of those festivals and where they are. A lot of them are in the Northern Territory, which is a predominantly Indigenous community. So there's really great music and arts festivals up there. There's like 17 around Australia. You've got the obviously NAIDOC week is a big week here in Australia, focusing on First Nations music. I mean, do they allow First Nations music, Alethea? Do you know from other countries, or is it just Australian First Nations?
I think that it depends on the festival. Each festival has like a different remit. It's probably like, we'll always, generally speaking, as a generalization, let our relatives from other countries play in those contexts. Absolutely.
Well, obviously Woodford Folk Festival, but that is massive and it is competitive to get on. There is the Katoomba Blues and Roots Festival. I know there's the Fringe Festival in Adelaide. There is ones available. There's probably too many I can name, but again, if anyone wants to write to me personally, I'm happy to share my festivals lists that I've accumulated over the years, just of local festivals and things, or if you want to go to Australia and you want to travel around, obviously we're a very big country. It also helps to look at the landscape of the country. People think, oh, I'm just going to go tour Australia. Well, they don't realize Australia's not like America, where you can get in a van and travel 2 hours and be from Nashville, and then 4 hours you're in Memphis, another 4 hours you're in New Orleans. It's not like that here. When you come to Brisbane, you fly into Brisbane, it's a 9 to 10 hour drive to the next major city, and then another 18-hour drive to the next major city. People don't realize how sparse, how spread out.
I think she's been stopped mid-sentence. So we do.
She's on her way to the next city.
She is. We'll come back to Sue when she comes back to us. We do have a question from Cody, who says, do you know of any Indigenous operated radio stations that artists and bands can reach out to? Alethea, did you want to, or Stephen, either one?
Oh, Stephen can probably finish the question with more specifics, but like I think you and I were yarning about this, Rhianna. There's a pretty much an Indigenous radio station in every major city, and like in capital city, and in the same way that you can look for the Indigenous festivals that Sue's talking to, it's really quite easy to find our Indigenous community radio stations as well. So in so-called Brisbane, it's 98.9, but also, a more community radio is Triple Z that play a lot of Indigenous music as well. And I'm sure Stephen has a much longer list.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot in regional areas as well. The communities, there's Karma, there's T-Bar, there's lots like that. But there's the National Indigenous Radio Service is a great place to go and get a list of all of them. So it's nirs.org.au. And that gives you a map of Australia, and it shows you where everything is. Don't get too daunted that it shows you every transmitter site. So not every one of those is a different station. There's probably about 25, 30 of them or so, I think, around the place. So if you use that website as the basis of your research, you should be able to jump on and see. Just bear in mind with a lot of those stations, particularly the ones that are in smaller areas, communication and things is sometimes difficult. There's some areas where the station is literally in a community of 100 people in a shed. So just beware. Certainly do not send them a gigabyte file of your video clip.
Yeah, so there's, as Alethea said, there is an Aboriginal radio station in every capital city in Australia. The only one that doesn't have one is Adelaide, which has a Indigenous program that you can send music to, and I think Tasmania is the same as well. And then, as Stephen was saying, there are a lot of other little stations within that, so it's about 100 all up. But note that some of those, particularly in remote and regional areas, English may be their fourth, fifth or sixth language. So a lot of those are language-based programs. But yeah, NERS is definitely a great place to go to find out where all of those stations are located and get in contacts for sure. And keep your questions coming through as well. Now, Alethea, we were talking about festivals in a pre-COVID world. And in terms of getting onto those festivals, how do you go about applying for them?
Well, it's good to keep track of their website details, because they will, if they have open call outs, that will be kind of really accessible, and you can see their process, and each festival has different processes. Some have a much longer lead in time than others, but also particularly in a multi-arts festival context. So I'm talking like Brisbane Festival, Darwin Festival, Sydney Festival. There's major cities and there's regional ones that are not just about music, but they're about multi-arts. And a lot of those festivals are actually looking for music experiences that are not just doing the exact same thing that the music industry is doing every Friday and Saturday night. And so they are starting to, particularly those festivals, hire First Nations producers, one of them. And the conversation has been around, that is actually a really great home for First Nations music, because it's people who are looking for perhaps a different storytelling experience, depending on, of course, what genre they're looking for as well. So those festivals, people just actually contact either the artistic director, or if there is a First Nations producer, they just contact them directly. They definitely have I find, a lot longer lead in time than some of the music festivals. You'd be contacting in a non-COVID world well and truly a year or more out for those multi-arts festivals, but they have, really strong, sometimes they have really strong international relations partnerships and different kinds of sponsorship that can actually support music and the arts in a different way that the music industry can, which is outside of the festival context, is quite ticket sales driven. So there's those different kind of pathways.
That's an important distinction that you've made there too, Alethea, that we don't just have the music festivals, which are just music. There are these other opportunities that exist within those bigger arts festivals that we have, which may actually allow more Indigenous music into those spaces than, say, a music industry context would, because it is seen as something that's different, that's something that the audience hasn't seen before, and something that the audience would appreciate in an artistic space rather than in the music commercial world space that we see quite often, I think, in the work that we do. Sue, I'll come back to you, because you did get sort of waylaid there with the technology. We've all had technological problems this morning, so you were mid-flight in that. But I wanted to talk to you about your sort of what your insights are into the Australian audience here, of how they consume music and the way that they find new music as well. If you are that overseas artists trying to break it here and understanding the way that we consume music. I mean, what have you seen in your journeys around Australia and within your own audience and your own followers?
Gosh, I think community radio has been really great for getting my music to audiences outside of the major cities. I get an APRA payment every 3 months from radio plays, and I'm still blown away that I'm consistently being played in community radio because it's getting requested. I also think getting out there and playing shows, I don't think anything beats actually just getting out and playing to real audiences, because when people see you live and they see your passion and you draw them in, they become an instant fan and they'll buy an album. I also think even going to Spotify now is a great way, creating your own Spotify playlist of artists you like, so that when other people, they might like, say, a particular band that you also follow. So you, by putting a playlist with that artist on it, they can then inadvertently discover you. And sometimes shameless promotion. It's okay to pay for a sponsored post one day if you're releasing a new song, or you have a new little song that you've put out, and I use Instagram now, I think, is even bigger than Facebook. I think people are using Instagram more than ever now, to get their music out. Australian audiences, it's a tough one. We have what we call in Australia the baby boomers. That's the generation sort of, I think, is it sort of 60 and up or 65 and up? Well, they were the big music, like back in the 70s and 80s, they were the ones going out to see bands. So they were around way before social media and cell phones and CDs and all that stuff. So I think they love having a physical product. So when I do gigs, I often find it's the baby boomer generation that will come up and want to buy an album. They don't want to do a digital download. They don't know the first thing about a digital download. And because of the genre of music I play, being, you know, country, blues, folk, a large percentage of my audience is that age group. So I try to cater to them. I always have physical copies of my album pressed and take with me to gigs, as well as digital download cards. But I find it's the younger generations that will come up and ask for the digital download because they want to taste test you before they buy a whole album. They want to download that one song, Alethea, that one song that grabbed them. They want just that one. They don't want a whole album. So I find having both as an independent artist, investing the money when you've got it, get some CDs pressed, make some digital download cards, have people available to access both, so they can go to your website and download your stuff from either Bandcamp or iTunes or Spotify, whichever one you choose. I think Bandcamp's good as an independent artist. They don't take as much of a cut as, say, iTunes, so I don't direct people to iTunes. I direct them to my Bandcamp, and having physical copies and approaching community radio stations. Send them an email, have a really great little 50-word bio and a really great picture. Take the time to invest the money, even if you can't afford it. Every 3 months, do one thing, like get a really good photo shoot with just 3 great photos and use those for the next 3 years, like I do. And but just get a really great photo and just get a really great little bio. Even if you haven't played that many gigs, just every time you've ever played, whack that in your bio. Just any opportunity you can get, send that out to community radio stations. As you said, there's a website you can go to in Australia that allows you to see the community radio stations. Say, for instance, you're looking at America, the college radio over there is actually a huge industry for getting independent music played. And there's thousands of college radio stations. And I'm sure if you search long enough, you'll find a platform where you can find out how to get your music heard by them. It's just about understanding your worth and taking the time to better yourself at your craft. Don't just think it will come knocking on your door, and don't be afraid to approach other musicians and ask for advice. We're all in it together, and if people don't respond, that's okay. Ask someone else. That's probably
good
my
advice, Sue. Good advice. Greenie, you look like you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, it was just something that Sue touched on early in that was whether you boost a post on social media. And I think, certainly social media is such a massive opportunity. Obviously, people see the downside of it, and there's a lot of that as well. But what social media can do is not just communicate with people, but it's also the cheapest form of market research that you can do. And certainly by using these platforms, you're going to get an idea of exactly what things that you're doing or content that you're producing that is resonating with people. And certainly when it gets to some of the paid stuff, it can be a really interesting way to enter a new market rather than, paying thousands of dollars to jump on a flight and actually, move, or come to Australia for a tour. You can throw $50 on a post and try and find an audience in Australia that is similar to the audience that you've got. You can create lookalike audiences using your Canadian fan base that you've built up on these social platforms, particularly Facebook, and look for people with similar traits to that live in Australia. There's certainly that's going to produce a lot of Canadian expats as well, I guess, but also just people that are, Facebook's algorithms will pick up the strangest things that you can't ever detect that your fan base might also be into. It might be that, everyone that likes your music happens to like red M&Ms instead of blue M&Ms, and so that you would never have asked, but Facebook will automatically find, probably not the M&Ms, that's probably going too far, but they'll find these strange similarities, and we've seen, with artists that for some reason there's a particular sport that their fans seem to be into, and you can't always even explain why these things are, but sometimes they are. And certainly if you can use some of those tools that are available to target an Australian audience before you start to spend huge amounts of money either getting here or buying ads or doing other things. You can see what kind of content and test your hypotheses. If you've got content that works really well on a Canadian audience, you can pay small amounts of money to see whether you would get that same engagement from an Australian audience. And also, even for festivals, I mean, if you're questioning, am I going to be more relevant to Tamworth or more relevant for CMC Rocks, you can try out your content on fans of each of those festivals and see which one works the best. So particularly if you're a nerd and love data analysis, as I do clearly, those things can be really valuable to you and certainly can just help with the education process of figuring out where your music's going to fit, and not just in Australia, but in any territory. We've got a metal band that we just discovered, for some reason in Chile, they love it. And when we do a paid ad in Chile, it will always return twice as much as Brazil, which we were looking at South America in general, but for some reason, Chile loved it. So they're great. You don't know figuring out why is often helpful, but it's not necessary.
Just on that, Greenie, is that kind of the work that you did when you were breaking or trying to break the late Dr. G into the US and UK market from Australia and taking an Indigenous artist from here and breaking them into a mainstream music industry over there? And if you don't know who Dr. G is, we don't say his name because he has passed, but I know that the family does allow that his name be used, so it's Gurumul if you're wondering who we're talking about, but for us we normally just refer to him as Dr. G. So can you talk a little bit about your work with Dr. G, Stephen, because is that a similar way that you use social media for him in his career?
Yes, I mean he's I would suggest that I would be using it far more now than what was a decade ago when that first album was really popping off. Actually, it's probably more than a decade now, isn't it? But yeah, I mean that it was a really interesting project in that the things that an Australian audience took from it was not necessarily the same as what an international audience did, and certainly it had a huge amount of success in Australia. It had a huge amount of success in the UK, and not as much success in the US. And there's probably arguments about the way it was marketed, all sorts of things like that. But I think just generally there are cultural differences about the way that the music was taken on board by people in each market. And certainly there was it was one of the first records that did mainstream well, that was in language. And obviously that is something that was I think not just to Indigenous Australians, but something that was important for Australia. Whereas when we go to the UK, the fact that it was in language didn't hold the same cultural significance, but there was that universal truth of the voice just cut through, and for markets where the language wasn't such a thing, I guess it was just that the quality of that voice piercing through. And there's a really interesting video of that's kicking around of an in-store appearance that he did when he was over in LA, I think it was, and they were just filming on their phone, and they had him set up, which was quite interesting. This was after he had a triple platinum album in Australia and was quite a huge thing here. When they went to America for the first time, they had him set up in a corner in the record store. They'd moved a shelf or something, and it was one of those, nobody was really there. They, someone introduced him and he just started playing, and the phone footage just watched as every head in the store just turned, and there was something as soon as he started singing that just worked. And I think it was, in terms of figuring out how to break other territories, it was about figuring out what the thing was that was going to be very important in each region. And when we marketed his final album in Australia, it was about the importance of having an Indigenous language album, and we shot for #1 and we got it. The importance of culturally of having that happen, and there was a lot of support for the record, and people were delving deep on that record in terms of I think Australia in general wanted to know more, and it was almost like opening a window into a culture that was closed for so many people prior to that. Whereas that same I guess moment is something that was part of the zeitgeist and part of what Australia needed at that point. If we tried to use that exact same campaign and put it in a US context, there wouldn't be the same. I guess that cultural thing that we were launching into would have been completely different. So, I think I would actually love to go back in time and take current day social media with us and see what that first record in particular would have looked like with social media and with the tools that we have open to us today. But luckily enough for us, we don't need to do that. We just need to find the next artist to do that with.
Exactly. We have a question, which I think may be to you, Alethea. When artists are showcasing at music conferences or festivals in Australia, what is a good way to attract industry folk to the show?
I think there's kind of two answers to the question, and obviously it's if you're going to be coming to a festival or one of the few conferences here in so-called Australia, then you do that the exact same way you would anywhere in the world, and you have to do that work months out from that conference and that festival, and you have to contact people. You have to do the research that we've been talking about across this whole panel to make sure that they're going to be people that want to come to your show because they work in your genre or they have similar artists to you, and that's the kind of space that they're looking at, and you organize those one-on-one meetings and you organize for them to come to your show. But I think one of the things that, because we get that question a lot, particularly from North America, is to remember that, and I know this through like dealing with international relationships at a consulate level, that because it is pre-COVID and who knows what post-COVID, so expensive to fly to this country, and also because we are more accustomed to traveling longer distance than mobs from other places in the world are coming to us. Like, it's normal for someone in the music industry to go overseas multiple times in a year, but I've not heard that necessarily the same back in people coming to our country. It's remembering that it's more likely that we've been invested in to go to your country to see showcases in your country or in other parts of the world. So it's also remembering that if you are in some of these conferences all around the world, particularly Europe and North America, is to remember that Australian festival bookers are there. Remember that Australian music industry are there. And if you really want to get us in front of you, like in that context, I would actually recommend using those opportunities just as strongly, if not more so, as a first step. Because coming here is we're a long way away. There's fewer of those particular conferences that I think you're talking about. So it's looking for ways to do that work months out. You see that there's going to be some of the Australian festival bookers and various other industry at the conference you might be attending, whether it's in Canada or America, and trying to get us in front of your showcase that way as well. And that's like incredibly important. I know that has been, it has been where consulates actually invest in Australians going to those festivals because they know that that's the best way for their investment, rather than trying to bring a whole band to our country for one kind of conference. I can't hear you, Rhianna.
Hang on. Yes, sorry. The radio person turns their mic off. Always happens. Hasn't happened. It had to happen now, didn't it? I was just saying, obviously find where the Australians are at those showcases that are, where you are, because we're most probably there, no doubt.
Absolutely.
So for you, I mean, how if you were to answer that question as well, of what you've learned over that time of doing showcases at conferences and getting people to see you at festivals, what have you used that has worked for you?
As Alethea said, months and months out, I look at what panelists are going to be at the particular conference, and I would check out, say, who from Australia was going to be there. I'd Google them, find out, what conference panels they're going to be speaking on, and go to that panel. And I mean, make sure you email them in advance. Obviously, some of them may be too busy to get in touch, but let them know you're going to be there and that you've got some questions that you'd like, if they have maybe a spare 5 minutes at that conference, if they could have a chat with you privately. Go to any panels that person's going to be speaking at, wait around till the end, wait to speak to them, make the effort. And also go to the showcases that they're most likely going to be at. Like if there's like Australian bands playing, go and watch the Australian bands, because it's not only about meeting the industry people, it's about meeting other musicians. Because again, get to know the artists themselves, become friends with them. And in that, once you get into their circle, then they're going to help give you advice and support as well when you go to their country. If you go to, say, the Americana Music Conference in Nashville, Australians are everywhere at that. Go watch a few Australian bands, to walk up to them, say hi, introduce yourself, give them your card. Don't be shy. Don't think it's, a bit stupid or a bit uncool to give out a business card. I've received heaps of them, and I've used them when I've then, the opposite, gone to another country and wanted to play gigs. So it works hand in hand. You support them, they support you. And again, it's about months and months out. I know most music festivals are at least 6 to 7 months before they actually have the festival. They're booking at least some of them a year, like they're a year out, the bigger festivals and conferences. So do your research, Google people. Look at who's going to be speaking, like, it's something like this. Google Alethea now, Google me, Google you. We have websites, we have our email addresses there. Contact people, don't be afraid to. As I said, as an independent artist, my biggest barrier was feeling that it's unattainable or that people won't want to hear from me. And some people don't. Some people are too busy. So what? There's always going to be someone who'll respond, and the information is always useful.
And I think
Sometimes you just
also,
need that
because we
one
were
person.
Yeah, and
sorry?
we were talking last night, Rhi, because I organize events, and I often remember that sometimes it takes me the follow-up email, like me personally, as someone that people contact, to remember, because if I don't respond straight away, I need someone to check in on me 2 weeks and be like, hey, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, yes, I respond. So remember that, like, everyone is a human being in this machine called the music industry. And so don't be afraid to do a follow-up email. Like, I appreciate that if I haven't responded, because it's likely I want to. I'm just in the middle of some ridiculous amount of deadlines and I can't get to it. And if you follow up, I'll be like, oh my gosh, yes, please, let's talk, organize that. Because, I'm often the person on the receiving end of having to do those follow-up emails, and just remembering that we're all human beings in this exchange is really, really important. And that if your email doesn't get responded to, it could just be that it's at the bottom of 1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
don't
what
take
is that?
Yeah.
So is that tip, Alethea, don't contact you anywhere between sort of August and October, generally, if COVID isn't happening?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I only
Greenie,
contact you on the 29th of February.
Greenie, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, because you've been a programmer in the past for Big Sound, which is the big music conference and festival that happens out of Brisbane every year. I mean, so you've been on the other side of that too, of, maybe you've got someone that you've programmed and trying to get people in front of that, because you can see that there's talent there and that people should know who that band is or who that artist is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for in my experience, particularly Big Sound, but also I did Mid-Em for a few years and things like that. Like, some of the best contacts that you get are by shooting for the middle rather than shooting for the top. Like, obviously, everyone's going to want to meet the number one booking agent in the country, So, and quite often those people are really approachable, and it's great. But it's about sort of looking through the delegate lists and looking at who the second or third tier down might be, because they're often much more approachable, and yeah, it's just a game of numbers. If you're getting 200 meeting requests, you're not going to take them all. But if you're getting 20 meeting requests, then you've got a pretty good chance. So find the person that's super relevant to you, that's probably only getting 20 meeting requests, and start there. And I think the other thing is just quite often you end up getting to the top of the tree by being a decent human to the people lower down. And even just describing it as that is awful. But when I was doing mid-em, some of the best meetings I got were through meeting people for a drink and them going, "Oh yeah, I know that guy," and yeah, I ended up having breakfast with the head of music for Microsoft. Or like the silly meetings that and also some of the best ones are the ones that you don't even know who the person is or whether they can do anything for you. Just meet the nicest possible people that you can and get amazing relationships. And even even some things for programming for Big Sound this year, talking to some programmers, and you just go, "Oh yeah, there's that person that I met I didn't even program them 10 years ago when I programmed Big Sound, but we just catch up now and then and go, how's things in your country?" I don't know, just because it's nice and because they're nice, and it's nice to be nice. And that's how you get stuff done.
Yeah, I have a suggestion too. In Canada, what is the music like? We have APRA in Australia. Like, do you know who the Canadian one is? Does anyone know? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, it's called SOCAN, and Alan just dropped that into chat because I was like, I have no idea. I know they have one. I just don't know. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
One of the greatest tools I've had when I've been traveling is go to them. And APRA has an office in Nashville, so we have often there'll be music conferences and things. APRA will let you know. Go to the website of whoever it is for your country and have a look. They generally have information seminars like this. They often have advice on panels or music conferences. Follow them on Facebook and things like that. And that's how I've been made alert to different things that are coming up, or training or songwriting camps or things that are coming up, is just by being a member of those. I mean, they're a great tool for musicians. And when I went to London, there was an Australian Musicians in London night run by APRA, and I got to go and meet other local Australian musicians living in London. And I've met a booking agent in London that was then able to get me gigs just by going to an APRA music night. That's a really great tool for independent artists as well, to meet people and other industry people and other musicians if you're traveling as well.
We've got a bit of time left, so if you do have a question, please get that in. I think Alan has a question, which is Stephen wearing a delegate badge? Are you currently at a music conference that we don't know about, apart from this one, Stephen, or is that your work pass?
No, I've got another webinar next. No.
Oh, okay. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the chat if you are on Zoom or somewhere else where our other moderators can find it and get that question to us. Alethea, I might just do a rapid fire with you over a couple of things that we haven't covered yet, just to get your ideas around some of these things. So music conferences in Australia, where should you hit if you can make it here and COVID is over?
I think there's obviously Big Sound, and then there's some that is just keeping an eye on changes and things like that have happened, as well as using spaces like the ones that are mentioned. I know they're not conferences, but people have often, including like the consulates, talk about Woodford and Tamworth and these places as being a space where you get your music in front of different people and can organize. You can organize those meetings that are ultimately what kind of helps. But if you go to any of the state's music organizations, so I work for Q Music, we often have those resources for our artists. So if you want to get to know our country, you can kind of use our music bodies to help do that, because we're providing that information for our artists. So just click on there and you'll find those informations, and often there's like a whole heap of festival lists in terms of opportunities for artists in amongst all of that. So, and just, keep track of everything as well. And think, if you like see that, for example, Big Sound has worked with Manitoba Music, so I would hit them up about that, because they're over in your country. And likewise, any of the places in Australia that have had partnerships with Canadian organizations, hit those Canadian organizations up to talk about that.
So Big Sound in Brisbane, Changes in Victoria, and you talked about the Tamworth Country Music Festival in Tamworth in New South Wales, and the Woodford Folk Festival, which is just north of Brisbane here in Queensland.
We still do the Ormy World Music Festival. Is that still around? Ormy?
I'm also saying
I don't think so.
No, and all of these things are with the layer of we're in a global pandemic as well. So
yes. Alethea, what are the best ways to connect with Indigenous artists in Australia in terms of the events that we hold, but also other ways that you can build those relationships?
So we have a number of events around a political protest day that is symbolic of invasion and survival. So there's Yarbin in so-called Sydney. Share the Spirit is the one in so-called Melbourne. We have other festivals like Dance Rights, which is November, if I get that right.
Sydney,
Rhianna.
yes.
Yep, as well as I know there's stuff like Quandamooka Festival that's linking into some of those multi-arts festivals here in so-called Brisbane. Quandamooka Festival happens in if you Google North Stradbroke Island, you'll find it, and then you can find the Indigenous history. And then there's also things like we have the gathering that happens every Wednesday, which is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists. It's run by Creative Nations. So these organizations you can kind of connect with, and they can talk to you about other opportunities. But the one way kind of to stay connected is I'm seeing more and more Indigenous artists from this country connect with those on your continent through social media and sharing their music and sharing conversations. I actually find a lot of Indigenous music from your lands through other artists from here sharing that, and they find it through me sharing it. So we are developing a global Indigenous music community, and so tapping into that is really important.
What would you say about travel advice for working musicians around work permits for here, visas, customs, biosecurity, all of those things that you should be thinking of if you're coming into our country that sometimes can not be on your checklist because you might not realize that you need to consider those things?
Just give yourself a lot of time so that you can work through whatever visa it is that you require to come here. And one of the really big things that happens so regularly with the artists that I'm working through is talking with either your consulate or the organizations you're working with to really understand what can and cannot get through customs, in particular instrumentation, particularly if we're looking at instruments that have any form of traditional instrumentation, whether that's in a contemporary or traditional context, and it uses different animal skins, different types of woods, being very, very, making sure you can actually get that through our country. I'm going to probably lean into often more likely than not, you cannot. So making sure that, you really do that research around what cannot come in, because you don't want to get here and find out that, this absolutely precious item cannot come with you, and therefore, it cannot be looked after. So that's why it's incredibly important.
And before we run out of time, Sue, I wanted to come back to you because you have a very big focus on songwriting, and it's something that you're teaching young people to do, particularly around collaboration. What is it about collaboration, and why do you think that this is a great way to also make those connections if you are in different countries to each other, of being able to tap into, that relationship and building that relationship through that means?
Yeah, I think songwriting, obviously, as we all know, as artists and musicians, is a great way to tell your truth. And sometimes with co-writing, I have found I have written the best songs I've ever written, because you're getting other perspectives. You're getting someone else. You might say something in one way and someone else might say it in another way that's more concise. And someone else might know guitar chords that you don't know, or another instrument that you don't know, and they can bring other elements to the process of, of the song that can make it more diverse. I mean, appealing to a more diverse audience. It's also really, you go deep when you go into a songwriting process with people. You go to places within yourself and within each other that can be really emotional, and you can sometimes help heal trauma with just songwriting. I've been in the presence of people that have long held traumas that in the process of writing one song, they have released years of pent up like emotion and anxiety, and we cry together, and then we laugh together, and then we play the song over and over, and each time they sing it, it's another release for them. And then I think for Indigenous people particularly, we have a long held generational trauma. Writing songs for community purpose with a whole group of young people, and being able to write about that shared trauma teaches non-Indigenous people about the story as well, in a platform that is gentle. It can ease people into their stories and their experience in a nice musical way, but it can also be very political. The best songs in our history, I think, have been political ones. They're the ones that are most memorable and have taught people things like perspectives they had never even thought of. So I think songwriting is really, really important, and sharing your story and writing with other people makes you a better writer as well. So that for me is the reason I love co-writing.
And so, Greenie, any final words from you on just advice in, bringing your music here, particularly Canadian artists, and coming this way, and working out the Australian music industry and the straight. And I know you're going to be talking later on in the week about playlists and things like that anyway, but final words from you.
Yeah, I think as I said, it's about figuring out what it is that you're trying to do with your music, and who you're trying to reach, and it's going to be completely different for everybody, but just having a really good handle on what it is that people like about your music, and digging deep into what it is it the voice, is it the lyrics, is it what you're saying, is it just that it's a banger? Like, all of those questions are things that you need to be able to answer for yourself. And once those questions are answered, whether you're trying to break Australia or Brazil or wherever it is that you're trying to go to, it's just going to make those decisions that you have to make along the way much easier. And I think having the ability to knock on the door of different countries and different cultures, and to figure out what the stories and the messages that you're writing, not just what you're saying, but what is going to be accepted on the other end, and how people are going to take it, and how people are going to learn from what it is that you're saying, because it's not going to be the same everywhere that you go. And that's kind of the magic of it as well, right?
For sure. And Alethea, in the last kind of minute I probably have, any final words of advice from you?
I suppose because it's, been something that's been, noted to me by other young and also emerging artists, is around, the fact that we are experiencing a pandemic that is disrupting the music industry. And so one of the things I talk about with young Indigenous artists in particular is that, these are not actually unprecedented times. They're quite precedented for our communities. We have experienced this exact level of disruption and then some, and our music has survived. So the music is going to out-survive the colony, and just to remember that.
Thank you, Alethea Beetson. Thank you, Sue Ray, and thank you, Stephen Green.
Thank you, Rhianna Patrick.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ray.